Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots, Chapter 10, Part B. I apologize that today's session will be a little longer than normal, but there unfortunately isn't anywhere for a natural break in the reading, so 10 pages. Here we go. From Herschel Island, the missionaries returned to Fort McPherson and reached there on August 25th. Now it was necessary to prepare for the final stages of the journey, which would take them 500 miles across the steep mountain divide to Fort Yukon and Dawson. They spent almost a week making ready and decided to travel by the well-known Rat River and McDougall's Pass route. The bishop was to be accompanied by Charles F. Johnson, who was returning to his home and family in Chicago after 11 years of missionary service in the North. Part of the preparations involved securing the services of guides, and it was arranged that Enoch Moses and Joseph Viverick would accompany them to the head of the Rat River. Each of the guides would be paid at the rate of 55 made beaver. Enoch wished to go to Rampart House, and for his additional services he would receive an extra 10 made beaver. Beyond that point, the travelers expected to manage without guides, since beyond Rampart House it was a river trip downstream. When all the preparations had been made, the party left Fort McPherson at 1:30 p.m. on Wednesday, September 1st, much to Johnson's relief. Quote, "We have started at last for our journey. The last few days have tried my patience sorely, and I am anxious to be on my way," unquote, he wrote. The Whitakers and John Firth and his wife of the Hudson's Bay post saw them off, fully expecting that they would not hear from them again until they reached Dawson. The party traveled downstream in 2 canoes. Charles F. Johnson and the bishop were in a Peterborough canoe. With them was W. H. Fry, a lay missionary, who set out with them but would return with the Indian guides. Enoch Moses and Joseph Vivera had a small canvas canoe. They paddled down the Peel River to the mouth of the Husky, where they camped for the first night in a drizzling rain. From the Husky they turned into the Rat River, and on the 4th day out, Johnson noted, quote, "Arose at 5:30 a.m. The rapids began at this place, so we started out tracking. Made about 4 miles by dinner time. This was considered fast traveling. I don't wonder that so many Klondikers turned back from here. Tracking on the Athabasca River is a picnic compared to this. It is a case of struggling with the ice-cold water over boulders or chopping away through tangled underbrush. After dinner, progress is slower. We made about 2.5 miles by 4 p.m. when we had a hole punched in our canoe and had to unload in a hurry," unquote. It was evidently too much for Enoch. He was taken ill, and as it seemed that the illness was likely to be serious, the bishop felt obliged to take him back to his friends. It would seem that Enoch's pleas of illness, while employed as a guide, were not infrequent. It had happened while he was with Bishop Stringer on at least one previous occasion. In 1922 he failed another missionary in similar circumstances. J. M. Crissell, the missionary in question, was suffering from a toothache and decided to go to Fairbanks, Alaska, where he understood that treatment was available. Enoch, for a fee of $200, agreed to act as guide, and they set out about the middle of January. Hardly had they reached Lapriere's house when Enoch decided that he would rather hunt moose than go to Alaska, and calmly persuaded another Indian to guide the unfortunate missionary back to Fort McPherson. Local report was that not infrequently did he treat white travelers in this way. He would start out and then offer some excuse for not continuing the journey. In the present instance, Stringer took Enoch back to Fort McPherson. By the time he had done so and secured the services of another Indian helper, a week had been lost. When Bishop and Joseph Vivera were engaged in taking Enoch back, Johnson and Fry decided to portage some of their goods on ahead, as the river was now too shallow for the fully loaded canoe. On the following day they started out, quote, "across the hills, each with a pack going in a straight line to cut across a big bend in the river. Built a stage at the end of our portage, cached our goods, and returned to camp. taking about 10 hours to make the round trip. The walking was wretched, mostly moss and têtes de femmes." Unquote. When the bishop returned with other helpers on September 10th, the water had fallen nearly a foot, and travel was increasingly difficult. Moreover, provisions were getting low, and efforts to conserve them by shooting game and living off the country were unsuccessful. To make matters worse, the weather was getting distinctly colder, and ice was beginning to form on the water where the current was slack. Not until September 20th did the party reach the divide at Loon Lake. At that point, as had been agreed, Fry and the Indians turned back, leaving the bishop and Johnson to complete the journey alone. Looking back, it appears as an extremely dangerous venture, but evidently both men felt that they were sufficiently experienced in the ways of the country to manage without native help, and that the calculated risk in completing the journey was preferable to several months of virtual imprisonment at Fort McPherson. The two men went on alone. Provisions were short, snow was falling, the weather was getting rapidly colder, travel was difficult, and often they had to cut birch clubs to smash a way through the ice for the canoe. Even then the stones often broke through its sides, necessitating stops for repairs. At times they felt they should return, but still they kept going forward, hoping that the Porcupine River would be open and navigable. For 6 days they traveled in such conditions, then came to the conclusion that they were only exhausting themselves without making very much progress. There were now 3 possibilities open to them. They might continue to go forward in the hope of meeting some Indians who would assist them in their journey. As, however, they were only covering about 5 miles a day, and there were not likely to be any Indians within the next 150 miles, that did not seem to be a very realistic course. They could turn back and return the way they had come, but that would be a long and tedious undertaking. The simplest yet most hazardous plan would be to travel directly across the mountains to Fort McPherson, a distance of less than 100 miles. They had a small map and a compass, and the journey looked comparatively easy. The distance seemed short, and the dangers were not apparent. They decided to adopt this last course, although Bishop Stringer commented that he dreaded the mountains at that time of year. Having made their decision, they cached the canoe and left 30 or 40 pounds weight of non-essential equipment, hanging it up in a willow tree beside the river. With it they left a note, quote, "C.F. Johnson and Bishop Stringer reached here September 24th on the way from Peel River to Dawson via Rat River route. Caught in ice, left canoe and effects here and left with pack September 26th, hoping to see Indians at Lapierre's house or Driftwood River. Provisions for 5 days only. Snow falling heavily. Hope to send back for effects if possible. No snowshoes and may find it hard traveling. Start out with firm trust in God's goodness and guidance." Unquote. Isaac O. Stringer. P.S. Sunday, September 26th. Start out for a short day as provisions short and camp miserable. Have discussed the possibilities this morning and think we may start for Peel River if no Indians at Lapierre's house when we reach there. iOS. They set out hoping to reach Lapierre's house, but found conditions most difficult and unpleasant. Snow covered everything, making it impossible to see where to walk. Sometimes, when the bank became impassable, they walked along the riverbed. On the Sunday afternoon they came upon a shack on which was written, quote, "A. Johnson left here May 31st, 1909, unquote. Quote, "We searched around eagerly," unquote, said Charles Johnson, quote, "to see if we could find anything edible, but did not find a single mouthful. Camped in the bush, a cold night, and only 1 blanket apiece now," unquote. For 2 days they trudged on, hoping to reach Lapierre's house, and trusting that when they did so there would be some Indians whose help they could enlist. On the 3rd day they got up at 4:30 a.m., and each made his breakfast of a cup of coffee and 2 spoonfuls of grape nuts. Still there was no sign of Lapierre's house, and they decided to cache another 30 pounds weight of equipment. There was now no other course than to strike out across the mountains for Peel River and Fort McPherson. The next 24 days were a nightmare. The route was unknown. Rivers only partly frozen had to be crossed and recrossed, leaving the travelers perpetually cold and wet. They had no snowshoes, which made walking difficult, and at times impossible. With the cold there came heavy fog, which was sometimes so thick that it was impossible to see even 100 feet ahead. For several days it was impossible to see at all, and at times the travelers lost sight of each other, even when only a few feet apart. Provisions were almost exhausted, and no game appeared. Even had there been any, they had only 2 or 3 rounds of ammunition left. Once they saw a mountain sheep, but it had seen them first and quickly disappeared. It was not until they were well on the way that they realized that there was a variation of 30 degrees in their compass, due to their proximity to the magnetic pole, which could, even in clear weather, lead them far out of their way. The bishop knew that there was a pass through the mountains, if only they could find it, but all the elements seemed to be conspiring against them. Hour after hour they tramped with their packs on their backs up valleys, through deep snow, often sinking down to insecure footing of boulders underneath, then climbing the mountainside, clambering on hands and knees, often in danger of slipping and falling hundreds of feet. At night they had no alternative but to sleep in the open without even a small fire, because they were well above the tree line and the mountains were barren. They had only 2 blankets, one of which they laid on the ground, and the other they tucked around them as they tried to sleep. Quote, "No one who has not experienced anything of this kind can realize what it means. Frozen blankets, the misery of shivering the greater part of the night, with scarcely an hour of sleep, starting as soon as daylight permitted in order to keep warm, and yet starting out into the great unknown with a mantle of fog, getting weaker every day, and now suffering through lack of water. We knew we must cross the mountains, but the ranges seem very high," unquote, wrote the bishop afterwards. Their miseries were increased by the fog. Not only did they lack incentive afforded by fixing the eye upon a spot in the distance and plodding steadily towards it, but frequently they came to precipitous cliffs, where a few more steps would have sent them hurtling to certain death. They had to make long detours around such precipices, and yet strive to maintain their progress in an easterly direction. It seemed endless and hopeless. As they walked, they noticed that in level places there was always a tendency for them to veer off towards the left. When the fog permitted, they walked 20 or 30 yards apart so that the man following might keep check on the direction. Never far from mind was the possibility of an accident. A broken leg or ankle, or even a sprain, would have been almost fatal. At last the travelers felt that they could no longer endure the lack of fire and water, and decided to return to the tree level by the first valley, even though it should lead them in a backwards direction. They descended by the first valley, and a week later they were back on their former trail, still west of the mountains. What a relief, however, to be in wooded country once more. They had made an open camp and decided to make some snowshoes, even at the risk of starving. Neither of them had ever undertaken anything of the sort before, but Johnson was adept with the axe and pocket knife, and the bishop tried his hand at lacing the frames. At length, by using every available piece of leather, and after 3 days of trial and error, they had produced what passed for 2 pairs of snowshoes. During this period in camp, the 2 men decided not to use the handful of flour which remained, but to depend entirely upon any wildlife they could catch or snare. So they subsisted entirely on 4 little red squirrels. Consequently, they started out weaker than ever. It was now 14 days, October 8th, since they had left the canoe, and 6 weeks since they had set out from Fort McPherson. As they started again, they found that the improvised snowshoes made traveling easier, but they had still not found the pass through the mountains. The feeling of despair was almost overpowering, and it was intensified by the knowledge that each choice could be a life or death one. It was only later the bishop discovered that on many occasions they had been within a few miles of the pass they sought. For many days neither of the travelers realized he was getting weaker. Each looked at the other and thought how thin, haggard, and weary he looked. Each was puzzled by the obvious lack of progress. Each prayed fervently, not only for deliverance, but for peace of mind while the horror lasted. The bishop felt an added responsibility, for he had brought a fellow worker into these awful circumstances. After some days, they concluded it was useless to follow the valleys, and they set a course due east by compass. Bishop Stringer said later that if the Queen of England had indeed had the word Calais engraved on her heart, there was no doubt that the word east would be marked indelibly on his own. They forged straight ahead, climbing range after range, often spending hours surmounting a single ridge, when, had it not been for the fog, they could have seen an easier path a little to one side or the other. As they journeyed, the two missionaries talked over the possibilities of the future. It seemed impossible they would ever get through, and they wondered how long it would be before anyone learned of their fate. Game was scarce, and it was unlikely that any Indian would pass that way. The uncertainty for their relatives would be the most painful, and there would be difficulties about property and insurance claims. At each camp they left a note with a broken twig or branch to indicate that humans had passed that way. It is said that in one of these the bishop left the photograph of his wife and family, which he always carried, feeling he could not bear the strain of looking at it. The greater danger of starvation, they found, was not a sense of extreme hunger, but the intense drowsiness which resulted. Always there was a feeling of physical exhaustion, and the almost inconquerable desire to sleep. Yet to sleep would have been fatal. Sometimes one of them would sleep for a time while the other one watched to make sure he woke up. So they struggled on, making about 3 or 4 miles a day. Since there was little game, the pair had 2 cartridges which they were saving to use to the best advantage. Sometimes they saw a ptarmigan, and once some caribou, but always too far away and out of range. A poor tiny sparrow, wounded in the wing, was seen fluttering along before them on the snow one day. The bishop managed to capture it, and it provided supper. Some years before, the bishop had heard of an old Indian tale of starving natives who boiled and ate beaver skins after scorching off the hair. In their desperate need, the old story returned to the missionary's mind. They had no beaver skins, but both men had moccasins and Eskimo mucklucks. They tried eating the moose skin moccasins and discovered that the dress skins had little or no food value. Then the bishop decided to try the mucklucks, which they found were more satisfying since they were of natural hide, still impregnated with some of the oil. The following terse comments from Bishop Stringer's diary bring the incident which gave him his sobriquet of, quote, the bishop who ate his boots, unquote, vividly to life. October 17. Traveled 15 miles, made supper of toasted rawhide sealskin boots, palatable, feel encouraged. October 18th. Traveled all day, ate more pieces of my sealskin boots, boiled and toasted. Used sole first, set rabbit snares. October 19th. No rabbit and snare, breakfast and dinner of rawhide boots. Fine, but not enough. October 20. Breakfast from top of boots, not so good as soles, very tired, hands sore. Tied up Mr. Johnson's fingers. This was the last entry the bishop made. Their strength was holding out better than they had ever anticipated, but they were quite weak and wondered how much longer they could survive. Great was their joy on October 20th when they reached a large river coming from the north. Johnson cut a hole in the ice, and as the water was flowing towards the north, they concluded the river must be the Peel. Darkness fell soon afterwards, and they camped for the night. The following morning they crossed the river and were further encouraged when they came upon some sled tracks. After walking about a mile, Johnson climbed the bank to investigate and found a pile of freshly cut poplar poles. He shouted the news down to the bishop, who replied that he thought he saw smoke downriver. Hurrying as much as possible, they came upon an Indian winter fishery. Quote, we stopped and thanked God for bringing us in sight of human habitation, unquote, said the bishop afterwards. They walked on and came to the houses of William Bitterwicka, Charlie Clusowet, and Andrew Cloth. The Indians did not recognize the bishop at first. They thought him to be in Dawson, and the emaciated travelers before them bore little resemblance to the bishop and his companion. Finally, one of them recognized Stringer's voice and said, quote, "I think it must be the bishop," unquote. Without delay, Andrew Cloth took them into his house, and soon his wife had a meal of roasted fish ready. Before long, some cooked rabbit appeared from William Vitrequa's house. When the travelers had temporarily assuaged their hunger, 2 good dog teams were harnessed, and they were quickly on the way to Fort McPherson, about 20 miles downstream. Quote, "I think I never enjoyed a ride of any kind so much," unquote, wrote the bishop. Quote, "For weeks we had been accustomed to the dull facing of difficulties, generally with all the odds against us. Now to sit comfortably in a carole, with good dogs before and a strong driver behind, to glide smoothly and swiftly over a good trail, seemed perfect happiness," unquote. They called at 4 camps and finally at 10 p.m. reached the mission, where they were greeted by the Whitakers with mingled astonishment, distress, and relief. On the following Sunday, a special service of thanksgiving was held in St. Matthew's Church to acknowledge God's goodness in preserving them from, quote, "so many and great dangers," unquote. Although the 2 men were now out of danger, they continued to experience a lurking fear for several days. It seemed that danger, disaster, and death might still overtake them. For several days, too, it was impossible to satisfy their hunger for more than a half an hour at a time. Because there was a danger of reaction, and because he still had the long journey to Dawson before him, the bishop began hauling wood, after a couple of days, to get the exercise which he felt he needed. During their almost fatal journey, which had lasted 51 days, each man had lost 50 pounds, but each succeeded in regaining it within a fortnight of their return to Peel River. At the beginning of November, Bishop Stringer set out once more on the same journey. This time he traveled by dog sled, accompanied by 3 Indians. During the trip, he was often plagued by the recollection of his recent hardships. He would be warm and comfortable and half asleep in his furs at the back of the sled, and then he would suddenly come to with a start and exclaim, quote, "I must keep going, I must keep going," unquote. On the way, he recovered the canoe and equipment which he and Johnson had left, and on November 20th they reached Rampart House. Here the bishop spent several days with Dan Cudzo, the trader, and his wife, who were occupying the former mission house where Stringer had stayed with Wallace and his wife on the first days of his visit in 1893. The bishop held several services and solemnized the marriage of Daniel Cudzo and Monica Najul, confirmed 19 persons, and celebrated Holy Communion. He conferred with each of the Indians as they brought in their thank offerings, and made arrangements for the completion of his own journey. Cudzo had 2 Indians who were about to start out for Fort Yukon, so the bishop paid off those 2 who accompanied him from Fort McPherson and arranged to go with these men. He left Rampart House on November 27th and reached Fort Yukon a week later. Johnson had decided to remain in Fort McPherson and to return later with the police patrol. When the bishop reached Fort Yukon, he received the first letters from his family and friends since his ordeal. But it was only when he reached Circle City, Alaska, on December 8th that he was able to send a message to his wife announcing his safe arrival. Originally, he had expected to reach Dawson by the end of October, and when he failed to appear, rumors and speculations quickly grew. During this period, Mrs. Stringer was staying with her mother in Kincardine, Ontario, where the latest of their children, William Randall, was born on October 28th. The Toronto Mail and Empire carried a report that the bishop had been drowned in the Yukon River, while other papers said that both he and his wife had been lost. The arrival of the bishop's telegram telling of his safe return was a matter of rejoicing for the whole community. Alex Stringer, who was then almost 6, recalls the telegraph boy racing up to the veranda of the Alexander home, waving the telegram in his hand and crying out, quote, "It's from the bishop himself," unquote. Everyone in the small town knew of Mrs. Stringer's anxiety, and all shared her relief. Immediately after receiving the bishop's message, Mrs. Stringer telegraphed him about the birth of their son. This was followed by a letter in which she said with a gaiety she cannot have felt earlier, quote, "Some of the papers said you and I were drowned in the Yukon, but as I knew I was not drowned, I consoled myself that you were not either." Unquote. Thus ended what was undoubtedly the most harrowing experience in the bishop's life, and it was probably some time before he could bear to let his mind dwell upon it. The recollection of the horror remained with him for the rest of his days, although it was lightened a little by his ability to see its humorous side. 2 years later, he gave a graphic description of the journey to a crowded audience in the Old Fellows' Hall in Dawson. By a strange and sad coincidence, even as he spoke, 4 other men lay dead in the snow in the same locality where he and Johnson had been lost 2 years before, and in almost the same circumstances. For some years it had been customary for a mounted police patrol to make the journey from Dawson to Fort McPherson and back, carrying the mails in each direction. At the time of the bishop's lecture, the police patrol under Inspector Fitzgerald had been away for some time, and he knew that they should soon be returning. 10 days later, a party of Indians arrived from Fort McPherson with the news that the police patrol had left Peel River before Christmas. They themselves had left after the New Year and had traveled by the same route, but had seen no sign of the patrol. This increased the bishop's anxiety, and he called at police headquarters, probably urging that a search party should be sent out. For the next 3 weeks, Stringer was away on a missionary journey downriver and did not return until Easter Sunday. On the following morning, he heard from the milkman that the members of the patrol were reported to have been found dead in the snow by searchers. A telephone call to the police detachment confirmed this. The bishop was stunned and overcome. He later wrote in his diary, quote, "It is a sad story with many unwritten and unspoken chapters. No one will ever know the full story of the struggle. Felt sad and depressed all day. Tried to read letters but found it difficult to do anything." Unquote. And that's the end of Chapter 10. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 11. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.